So, of course, the question is, why Latin? Latin's a dead language. Technically speaking, a dead language is a language that has fewer than 100 native speakers. That's fewer than 100 people who've learned it since birth. That may be about to change since I have 6 boys who have had to listen to me blab at them in Latin. So we only need another 94 people, and we may be able to resurrect this thing. But of course, the big question is, who can you communicate? Why would you study a dead language? Well, it may be dead, but this number here, 41,364 words in the English dictionary of Latin origin, tells you that, well, one of the things that one of the groups of people you can communicate with is English speakers. In a sense, Latin is your language, and you can look at the stats there and see other top contributors to the English language are French and German. But there's an interesting thing about this. If you look at this chart, based on the Latin shorter Oxford English Dictionary, the shorter version, and a 1973 study, which is older, but has not been substantially disproved or changed by any more recent studies, it shows that Latin's coming in at about 28%, French is coming in at about 28%, but the interesting thing is that French words that have made their way into English are from a Latin base. So for instance, the word nation, we have from French, but the French got it from the Latin natio. So actually, greater than 50% of your language is Latin. And we just have some peculiarities of French spelling, just a few. And nothing else has contributed as much to this language as Latin. So who can you talk to? Well, English speakers for one. And so that's my first point, language. Here are a couple facts about it that are interesting. English is nearly 30% Latin in origin, not counting the French, which is the other part. This is going to help you with your English spelling, especially for any words that are more than 2 syllables. Any words that are more than 2 syllables in English are very likely to be Latin. And this gives you an opportunity to communicate with people in other languages. Today I was at the park. I sat down in a pavilion with my 6 boys to have lunch, and there was a grandmother and her granddaughter there. Grandma did not speak any English. She is a native Spanish speaker. We talked a little. I'm sure that she corrected me a couple times. But we can communicate a little bit. And that's one of the wonderful things. And I haven't even studied Spanish. If I actually studied Spanish, Italian, Romanian, I would find some serious similarities between these languages because they're all descended from Latin. And of course, this is also going to build your English vocabulary. I want to point out Exhibit A, 3 students of ours. Abby Holcomb, Abby Shire, and Andrew Collins. Andrew Collins is in the U.S. Army, and he was stationed in Romania this past year, and he sent a message to me. Mr. Cockett, they speak Romanian here, but I can understand a little bit because I know Latin. Now, Andrew is not a tremendous student in Latin, but Romanian is from Latin, and so he could understand it. Abby Shire was at college studying for English literature, but she had to take a language class. She took Latin. She aced it. She was also not just the most tremendous Latin student, but she got A's in college, and so it was easy for her because she'd seen it all before. Abby Holcomb didn't even study Latin in college, but she was with a friend at college who was a divinity student studying Greek, and he couldn't figure out his Greek. She said, let me look at it. She said, this is what's going on in this grammar, and she knew it because Greek grammar and Latin grammar are very similar. So language is your first good reason to study Latin. Second, let's talk about standardized tests. Standardized tests are really important to parents, teachers, bureaucrats, and politicians. And if you have taken Latin, you may study or you may pass all of your peers by on standardized tests. This is the SAT up through 2016. You can see more than 10 years of data there. And the colors that you're looking at, the lowest line is all students, whether they had taken a foreign language or not. Next up, blue line, is Spanish. If students had taken Spanish, they scored significantly higher than the run-of-the-mill student. French and German, higher still, but the highest of all categories in verbal scores is Latin. In your handout, you can see all the documentation if you want to look it up. You would think it wouldn't be true for students in math scores, but it's actually true in math scores as well. That top bar of scores is the scores for students who have studied Latin. So obviously, this correlation doesn't necessarily prove causation, but there's a pretty strong correlation there, and it's pretty steady over a number of years. Our second reason, or third reason after standardized tests is going to be access. So when you know a language, you have access. Right now, you have access to the English-speaking world. If you study Spanish, you have access to a huge portion of the world. French, Chinese, huge numbers of people in the world then you have access to because you know their language. But the interesting thing about Latin is it gives us access in a different way. That's what this chart shows us. What you're looking at here, hang on a sec. I'm sorry, it was so small. What you're looking at here is a chart that is ranged from 2000 BC on the left to 2000 AD on the right. What I want you to see here is how long these languages have been around. Chinese is one of the oldest languages in the world. English is a very, very late comer. And honestly, you can't even read English from its beginning. It's so different that you couldn't pick out more than a few words if you had to look at it. Chinese is one of the oldest, but it's changed so much over time that if you know modern Chinese, you don't know ancient Chinese. You cannot read them. They're not mutually intelligible. Hebrew has a big gap in it, which happened after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Same with ancient Greek. The ancient Greek that Plato and the Greek philosophers knew, that Greek, it no longer exists. Modern Greek is different. But the thing that's really fascinating about Latin is that you have access backward across time through 23 centuries, more or less. That's a lot of access, and it's mutually intelligible. I've read some of the earliest Latin that we have records of, and I've read things that were written this year in Latin. Our fourth good reason why you should study Latin is careers. Latin, one of its extra special powers is that it is the basis for the technical vocabulary for most careers in information technology, in biology, in medicine, in philosophy, in chemistry, you name it. Most technical vocabulary is from Latin or from Greek, but again, primarily the bulk of it's from Latin. There are some examples up there, like the selection from the periodic table of the elements, the top right. All those apparently random letter combinations that are assigned to different elements are honestly based on Latin names. A biologist who's looking at different kinds of tree leaves and is going to describe them scientifically is going to use a chart like the one on the left. And he may have to read the descriptions underneath to know that falcate means hooked or sickle shaped, but I don't, because I know what falx means in Latin. I can see through the scientific and technical vocabulary and have a really good guess at the meaning. The other thing that's interesting about that is that Latin can give you an edge in certain careers. Here I have two people. People always ask me, what are you going to do with Latin? What kind of career is that? And I say, well, hey, I'm making a living doing Latin. But if you don't want to do that, well, on the right, Drury Bell, one of our graduates, 2014, does want to become a Latin teacher, and he is pursuing a master's in classics. He was a diligent student, and when he left here and went to college, after his entrance exam, the head of the department told him, look, you don't need to take first and second year courses. You go right to third year course. And after his freshman year taking junior level courses, the head of the department said, look, if you want to take some master's level courses, you go ahead. So he is finishing simultaneously his bachelor's and his master's right now. He's about to be done. And he was gifted in classics, and he's making that his career, and most people aren't going to, and that's great. Amanda Holloway, graduated in 2010, is wrapping up her doctorate in pharmacology, or pharmacy. And she had to take Latin as part of her courses in medicine in her undergraduate. She had to take 2 semesters of it. She was a pretty steady student. She wasn't brilliant at it. It was not easy for her. She made A's both years. It was fun and easy for her because of the preparation she received by studying it here. Communication. This is a big thing, and it's a big focus of this school. We want our students to be able to think clearly so that they have something to say. And when they say it, we want them to be able to say it precisely and not beat around the bush and use the wrong words so that it lacks force. And we want them also to be able to communicate in writing. Studying any language will help you with this, because it forces you to think harder about communication, which we kind of take for granted. But Latin is especially good for it because of reason number 6, discipline, mental discipline. Latin is very complex. It is one of the more complex languages, and it requires you, if you want to see the stats on that, you should look at the footnote in your handout. It requires a lot of concentration. And students, you know that it requires a lot of perseverance. It is not an easy thing to learn. You have to be careful to observe things, and you have to follow logic in order to explain and make connections between all the words in a sentence. It's really rigorous mental training on the order of something like mathematics, a higher mathematics or logic. It's excellent training. Your seventh reason is because you're an American and because you're a Westerner. You come from probably the Western Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere. The foundation of your culture is built on Rome. If you want to understand who you are, if you want to understand why your culture is the way it is, why politics are the way they are, if you want to understand what art and music mean to people in your world, you can do it without the study of Latin, but if you know Latin, it's a whole lot easier. It's a key that unlocks all of it. And honestly, Roman history is American history. You want to understand why our constitutional framers set up the Constitution of this United States in the way they did? You want to understand why we went with a republic instead of a democracy? All of the answers are contained in Roman history, and our founders looked to that history, especially in crafting the government and the Constitution of this United States of America. It's also the key to your future, again, because you're an American. If you look at the things I've listed here, these are things that we're anxious about, that we're worried about. These are problems we're trying to solve. Partisan politics, where people can't get along, they can't even pass a law, they're so busy trying to cut one another off at the knees. Executive overreach, presidents taking way too much power on themselves. We have welfare pressures, we've got rich versus poor, polarization of society. We've got protracted wars on foreign soil that we just can't seem to get out of. We've got terrorism and financial instability. Every one of these things was dealt with repeatedly by the Romans in their republic and in their empire. And sometimes they were successful, and sometimes it led to the ultimate ruin and downfall of their civilization. I think it's good to learn from other people's mistakes, and that's why I'd say for the sake of the future, reason number 8, you want to study Roman history, and a great way to do it is to actually read it in Latin. 9, character. Reason number 9, mental discipline or character. Mental discipline was one of our points. Now, moral discipline or character is another. You see, because Latin is not a skill. It's not merely a skill. It's also some materials and subject that you study. When you study the Latin language, you don't just learn a language and a means of communication. You don't just learn grammar and skill in written communication or mental discipline and processes of analysis. You also have to read something in Latin. And by and large, what you can read in Latin is excellent for holding up in front of you excellent moral examples of courage and self-sacrifice, and above all, patriotism and bravery. There are so many good examples to be found here that add to the examples we already have. And they're compelling examples. And this is honestly what I care most about my students getting. I don't care so much whether or not they're going to do well on a standardized test. Also, that's going to happen more or less by accident if you study Latin. But I especially care that my students get a chance to encounter and meet the great characters and great men and women of the past in their study of Latin history, or Roman history and Latin literature. And so I would say number 9 is bigger than a lot of other reasons that have come before it. Number 10 is because you're a Christian. Because you're a Christian, you ought to study Latin. I can't wait for the questions on that. But, as a Christian, you have a different ball game. If I may speak just to the students for a moment, if you're a Christian, you're not actually in school for the grade next week. You're not in school for the grade at the end of the year. You're not in school for the grade at the end of your senior year. You're not even in school for the scholarships that will come from the grades to get you into college. And you're definitely not in it for college. You're also not in it for the career that follows college. I don't know if you realize this, but as a Christian, these are all gods that are way too small. You cannot worship the grade. That is a God that is miserable and unforgiving and demanding and will never give you anything. And scholarships and college and career can be the same. You don't believe me? Ask the adults in the room. Careers are difficult. Work is difficult, and it's not always what you imagine it to be. These are gods that are way too small for you to worship. So if you're a Christian, you need to have a much bigger goal. You're going to live forever. You may as well be working towards a goal that's going to last as long as you. And that's why I would say it's a great idea to have, as a Christian, access to 23 centuries of resources and inheritance in these Latin authors, to have the wisdom that comes from reading that history, to have your character formed by reading that literature, to have your mind sharpened by it. These are great tools that you can use for the service of Christ, for the service of his church, for the service of God's kingdom, in whatever career you're using or whatever career you're going to pursue. And that's the other reason. We don't study Latin for its value as a career. In fact, we don't study anything in school for its value as a career, or we shouldn't. These are part of what prepare us and arm us and equip us for the service of God. These are all just preparation for life. And we can use all of these things even if we don't work a 9-to-5 job. Using Latin, it still is applicable and helpful to anyone. And so those are our 10 reasons why I think that you should study Latin. And of course, just one caveat, throughout this, it makes it seem like I'm championing the study of Latin above all else. But that's only because it's not been fashionable in the last half century to study Latin. When it becomes unfashionable for people to invest in the study of algebra or mathematics, then I'll stand up here and preach about why you ought to study that as an American, as a Christian, and as an individual. But right now, I'm just mentioning Latin because that one is a particularly big target nowadays. So that's the end of my first affirmative constructive. We're going to take a pause now, and then we'll call out the devil's advocate and hopefully have lots of questions from you that we can fight over. All right?